So funnily enough, wars, particularly when they're involving a large proportion of the populace, are a vehicle for female empowerment, because suddenly women have to step into the male role. And it becomes a case of, when you restore peace, are you able to wrest that power back onto the patriarchy or not?
Welcome to HolisticCircle podcast, Spiritual Conversation. My name is Philipp Kobald. We are reaching out to people who are passionate about spreading light, love, and joy and wisdom. And I'm happy here for another Christmas special, Katie Dean. Hello, Katie.
Hi, Philip. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute joy to connect with you again, because we always have the most interesting conversations. And
Yes.
I was fascinated to dive into what we've got lined up today.
Yeah, me too. I can't wait. But we have to take the people on board because we are both giddy to get it started. But that's how it's supposed to be. Well, we had the last couple of episodes been watching, this is my Christmas house cleaning. I enjoy so much. I had like almost 100 conversations this year, and it's my great pleasure to invite a couple of people for a second round where some links are open, things are unfinished, or new subjects came up. And so Katie and me have the second conversation. The first one, you may look for it there. We get a better self-introduction of her, talking about sacred geometry and things like that. But there's so much more to Katie. And so this is one of our Christmas specials. And with that, I would like to jump right in so we can have the full hour, because there's so much we can talk about. So please enjoy this Christmas special with us, and I hope it will be shortly before Christmas, so you can jump on Katie's interesting sacred geometry Christmas special herself. So we're all having Christmas specials. Katie, maybe quickly give us a quick rundown of your background so people understand why we're here, and make a quick commercial for your Christmas special as well, to get this right out of the way, so then we have a peaceful hour of pure enjoyment.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes. So I am Katie Dean. I ended up reading history at Cambridge University and walked out of there with a PhD in the year 2000. Decided not to continue in academia, and instead I went into the corporate world, which I survived for about 2 years before collapsing, completely burned out. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, eventually told I would probably never recover, and it seemed like my entire life had gone up in smoke. It took me 20 years, but I have now fully recovered, and my life has evolved so that I'm now guiding other people out of burnout if they've got there. But ideally, I would prefer to guide them to reconnect with themselves fully so they don't get to the burnout phase. And yeah, I'm doing this through a system that I've created using sacred geometry and color. You can see some samples behind me. And yes, as Philip said, I am presenting a wonderful, very exciting event this Advent, which we will be using a very special geometry that I have not shared publicly before. Each day during December, you will be invited into an online community space where you will get to open a door, which will magically reveal a color, and you'll be using that color to color in a part of the geometry. Now, the significance of this is you're ending up creating a piece of beautiful artwork that's actually giving off healing frequencies. So as you're exploring all of this, you are also going to be sort of letting go of whatever's happened in 2025, calling in what you desire to experience in 2026. And your piece of artwork at the end of December will embody all of that. You can hang it on the wall and enjoy those supportive frequencies throughout the year. But I would just mention, if this sounds amazing to you, please order early, because there's a physical gift box that comes with this, which I'll need to ship to you. And you can find all of that on my website, the Colorland system, that KOLORLAN system.com. Hopefully there'll be some notes written in the show notes down below that will take you there as well. So yes, that's me. Thank you.
This was a wonderful presentation. This was well done. So everyone, also from me, I've discovered through you again, I'm a big color freak, but I've discovered again sacred geometry. And since we last spoke, it kept it on my mind. And it's definitely one of the big treasures of intuitive healing, where we don't know absolutely perfectly how it works, but we do know, does it work? And it's so soft and so gentle, and it really changes. And as a anti-stress thing, you really have come up with something very interesting. And this whole year, I discovered so much more about sound healing than I ever knew. I discovered so much more about sacred geometry and other things, actually. I think this is great that we are bringing a great toolbox to people, how to deal in a soft and simple, intuitive way, and connecting and releasing. So, well, with this, enough commercials. It's time to have some fun. You said that you have in Cambridge, was it, right? PhD,
that's right.
that you study history. And that's exactly where we're going to diving in now. So prepare yourself for make yourself a hot cup of tea. You're going to need it. You're going to have a wonderful dive into history. And why are we doing this? Why talking about spirituality? And everybody wants to hear about sound healing and sacred geometry and therapy and things like that. Why do we, from time to time, or quite regularly, bring in historians, bring in academia, and look at it, either religion or societies or certain development through a historic lens? Simply because I do. And that's basically the best explanation I have. First of all, I love it. I enjoy it. I can't wait. And I think it helps a lot sometimes to go back in time, and maybe sometimes to go ahead in time, and sometimes to be exactly in the time. So if you're like me, if you enjoy a good conversation, going back in time and learning from our ancestors, or living one with them, the exciting steps that they took at the time, well, then please feel welcome. So I would very much love for the people who are maybe new to the time frame, if you could first of all paint us a picture of the time that we're going to approach, and try to make it as juicy as possible, what housing people had, what kind of societies, what structures, and I'll be asking a couple of questions on the way. So please.
Lovely. Yes, before I dive into that, I'd just like to pick up on what you were saying about the interest in history, because it's actually one of the questions we have to consider as historians in the academic world. Why are we studying history? What is the point of that? And I would say it's ideally so that we learn from it and avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Same as in our own personal history. Why do we hold on to our childhood memories? Because until we've processed them, they're going to keep coming up for our soul to experience and learn the lessons. So this is like the childhood of our country, if you will. And it is specifically England that we're going to be diving into today, and the 17th century. So this was, my PhD began at the point at which Elizabeth I had died. She died without any children. So it was actually a cousin from Scotland, James I, he was James VI of Scotland, who inherited the throne. And it took place through his children and ended up with more catastrophe at the end. It's one of the most fascinating periods of history because it's just so chaotic. We had a civil war in the middle of it. We had the only time in British history where there was no monarchy for a brief 11-year period. We had a man called Oliver Cromwell who ruled over the country, not as a king, although you could argue that a lot of the way in which he ruled was quite similar to monarchy. We had another king overthrown in a slightly more peaceful way, in a more peaceful bringing in of William of Orange and his wife Mary at the end of the century. So it was absolute turmoil. And I'm finding that I can actually relate to that from where we are sitting today, because the reason this turmoil had come about was, you want to go back to the previous century, and we've got the Reformation. You have to remember, back in this time, there was no perception of it there being any possibility that God didn't exist. We didn't have all the scientific discoveries that we have today, or the understanding of the world from the sort of rational perspective that we have in this day and age. So if you wanted your crops to grow, your life to flourish, you needed to make sure that you were in good communication with God, and saying your prayers, going to church regularly, doing everything that your local priest told you to, and hopefully then life would go smoothly. Under the Catholics, we'd had a Catholic church throughout Europe up until the Reformation that had never been questioned. And that was very much about the church controlling the people. So we had the Bible, which was the word of God, written in Latin. As your ordinary, average, everyday person, I don't speak Latin. In fact, I probably don't read and write at all. So that leaves me very much at the mercy of what my local priest tells me I'm supposed to do and believe and so on. The Reformation comes along and says, no, this is not good. We each are allowed to have our own connection with God. So let's start translating the Bible into English so that ordinary people can read it. But that's still not me as a working class person. I might be living in a city like London, but I'm more likely living out in the countryside in a little tiny community where I've got all my friends around me in fairly basic housing, probably. If I'm rich, I will probably be spending my life at courts in London, trying to curry favor with the king to make sure that my lands are safe and there will be people back home on my great landed area, farming it and looking after it for me. But interestingly, amongst that, we've also got the evolution of the printing press. So suddenly, for the first time, we've got this new thing coming in that allows people to gain information in new ways. Again, I would sort of equate that a little like the internet, where you're not reliant on just your neighbors. You've got suddenly connections with a wider world and much more awareness of what's going on politically. Therefore, more awareness of the turmoil that's unfolding. When we get, sorry, go ahead.
Let's make a quick moment so people see the urgency of the time. As you just explained, and just recapping you, it was a time of massive change. Yeah. First of all, there was huge political uncertainty, which has not been usual before. Either you had a very strong structure, maybe one king cuts the head of another king, but basically everything was quite straightforward. To have this very uncertain situation that you had civil war and both back there different religious ideas fighting with each other and massive new technology. So this was basically the perfect storm in the making. And that's why it's relevant to us to look at these people. And then you also explained that people had a very simple structure. They were either landowners and with vast properties, or they were basically working for these landowners. And some maybe had small farming themselves, but this was already a rare case. So basically the property structure was well off. So people were not, either they were super well off or not well off that much at all. So this growing city standard that citizens that had some in between were not that big, that the so-called middle class was hardly to non-existence. And education, as you said, also was privileged to certain people. So overall, it was a society that many of us can actually, again, understand. That's the point that you've been making. And the last point, which I think is one of the focuses of our conversation today, because we both find it quite fascinating, is just such a little while ago, clear for people were that God exists, that there's good and evil, that basically their farming is directly as an effect if how much they pray, how good Christians they are. And that's basically how these are connected, and so many other superstitious concepts and ideas. So while church was there and Reformation, there was still an echo of a time before that was more into witchcraft and superstition. So all of these things were overlaying each other. And that's why you and me both think that's not such a bad allegory for the time we're living in right now. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to go into, so how I see this is we're looking at this art from the point of introducing a new idea, the Reformation. So that was Martin Luther on the continent, but then Henry VIII, who brought it in England. And any new idea that comes in takes a little while to get established. And you've got this really chaotic period of, is the old system going to win out? Is the new system going to come in? If the new system comes in, who's going to retain power? What's it going to look like? And the 17th century is this sort of juicy period where not only have you got the Protestant Catholic divide, also within the Protestant church is trying to shape itself. So how is that going to look? Is it going to be a very organized, formalized church, much like the Catholic, but just without a pope in Rome? Or is it going to be much more informal? You've got these little groups emerging in the Civil War because the political system had completely broken down. So that's let this freedom come through to experiment and see what's going to work and what's not. So you've got groups like the Quakers actually emerged in this period of time. They've obviously survived, but there were a lot of other little religious sectarian groups like ranters who did not survive beyond the 1660s in a lot of cases.
Sorry to break, I'm so sorry. But I think not so many people maybe are aware of that. Basically, at the time when your landlord changed from Catholic to Reformation, it meant that all the subjects in the area would supposed to have changed as well. Until that time, basically, whatever was the landlords or the kings or whatever princes' new religion would automatically be expected that the subjects would follow along. And people have forgotten that that's why it changed from one day to another. So the idea that some groups on their own using this chaos to make up their own mind and trying to build something, basically we have not seen almost since the Greek polis when they tried different systems of statehood at the time. So it's quite significant and most likely important for your story continue. So sorry for interjecting.
No, I love that you're interjecting and pulling all of this together. It's great for me because I will just say to the audience that I completed my PhD, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago. I haven't looked at it since. So Philip said, would you come and talk about your PhD? I was like, I'd love to, if only I could remember what I wrote. So I'm loving you interjecting and putting the pieces together when I'm getting scattered and confused. Thank you. Yes, so as I was refreshing my memory as to what I'd actually written, I pulled out a few threads that I felt would be really interesting to explore that against this background of chaos and trying to establish a new norm. One of them was censorship and control, because of course, if you're living in this very previously stable space, exactly as Philip, you just described, where the king or the landlord is dictating what all of their individual subjects are doing, that can only happen if you've got a way of telling all of those people what they're doing and making sure that they 100% understand that and they're not aware of any possibility of doing something different. So when the printing presses come in, obviously that endangers this because anyone has a license to print. So we've got this, okay, how do we regain control of that? That has happened by the early part of the 17th century. But when the whole constitution broke down in the 1640s, that control was also lost. So the censorship that had previously existed briefly disappeared. And you've got these different groups all actually using the same kind of language to describe one another, which leads me into a second theme that's very interesting that was prevalent at that time, which is what is in academic terms described as millennial writing. Is basically this idea that the world is about to end. And when the world ends, you want to make sure that your lifestyle is on the side that's going to see you off to heaven and not down to hell. So this was pulled in to say, so first of all, we had Protestants saying popery, Catholicism is the Antichrist. So if you are determined to follow the Catholic Church, you are selling your soul to the devil and you're going to end up in hell. Then we've got these different fragmented bits of the Protestant Church coming in and saying, oh, no, it's not just popery that's the Antichrist. So the Baptists are the Antichrist and the Quakers are the Antichrist and the Puritans are the Antichrist. And it just reminds me of some of the tropes that we're seeing today where we've got certain, well, maybe anti-Semitic could be one of them, anti-racist. We've got these sort of polarizing themes coming up, which are just really simple ways of getting people to take a preference to jump on one bandwagon or another without understanding the deeper arguments and understanding the relevance of it. And in fact, I actually pulled out a couple of quotes from the documents, the original documents there. One in 1654, a guy called Richard Baxter wrote that the common opinion that the Pope is Antichrist doth prevail more with the vulgar that can't dispute against particular doctrines of Rome than all direct arguments that are used. So in other words, your average uneducated person is not going to be interested or understand when you point to this particular passage in the Bible and say that's why you shouldn't be following the Catholic Church. They are going to understand when you just say the Catholic Church is the Antichrist, follow that, and you'll go to hell. So that was in the 1650s. 1682, the same thing is still going on. We've got another guy, John Owen, who describes this idea of popery as the Antichrist being the principal means of preserving the body of the people in an aversion unto popery. So again, we've got this theme of we don't need to get into the nitty gritty and the religious arguments here. We just come up with this simple trope, throw it at whoever is our enemy, and that will keep the people docile and controlled.
I'm so with you. And looking at our time, I don't want to go into specific conflicts because it would bring the podcast into the wrong place. But we just had a conflict now in the Middle East recently, and not having a position one way or the other here in this podcast right now. But I was shocked to see that we are back to a TikTok generation that just used like a claim, not knowing where it comes from, not knowing the complexity, but just using any 3 seconds TikTok thing, and you see a crazy picture maybe of a child being hungry or being in distress. Of course you feel for the child. How would you? You're a human person. And then you have a claim, a strong political claim that everyone can understand in its brutality just with the picture. Mm-hmm. And then you see educated people, even students or other people, which you would expect more from, running with being energized just with the claim. And I knew from personal conversation that they had no understanding of the complexity of this problem and understanding both sides and why it is what it is. And it's okay to be on this or that side, but at least do it consciously. I'm on this side because I stand for it and I know what it means. But these 2-3 seconds TikTok politics really got me. I was very upset with the...
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you there. And it's fascinating to see that they may not have had TikTok back in the 17th century, but they were using that same process of you've got a handful of people at the top of the power chain who have vested interests in one particular outcome versus another, using this really simple idea that they know, and it's designed to instill fear, like the deepest fear. So today, I mean, you mentioned emotions might be stirred by seeing a child in suffering. And I'm for sure they would have been in the 17th century as well, but they didn't have the images to be able to share there. So they're stirring their emotions by the one thing that means the most to them, the salvation or not of their soul. Because as we put in the beginning, there is no concept that we don't have a soul, that there isn't a heaven, there isn't a hell, that God doesn't exist. In the 17th century, your entire desire is to get out of life by going on to heaven. So if you're in any way endangering your soul, there's no way that you're going to take that path. And so it's tapping into this deep fear, which actually hits the nervous system in the body. I now know from my current work. So it's actually literally physiologically bypassing the potential to access rational thought, to step back and go, hang on a minute, if you're saying this, what about that? And to actually delve into evidence and come to an educated conclusion, whichever way that lands. So it's very much about power and control.
So I take this here in a small micro break. First of all, I took me very hard what you said, that this is all the consequences of a political system that was well established, a little bit crumbling and falling apart, that this is what, then this different fractures started to fight for the power and to use mean, ugly ways of manipulation, pamphlets, and where it hurts. So this is something that I think we can relate to, because everybody's talking about the superpowers, be it the old system, just Russia and America is falling apart. Now you have China and Europe and this and Africa and India. So this might be really something we can look at once the current system of structure is under jeopardy. Everybody try to squeeze in and carve a little bit power out of them, and they're using it by brutal means of manipulating what people's most sacred. And another thing that you brought us to remembrance is a world where us really believe that God is real. Good and evil is real, real, not like a concept. There are angels and devils walking around the earth, and that's a fact. We're forgetting that.
Yeah, we have got very detached from that. And it was interesting for me going back and absorbing myself in that, because I don't come from a religious background. I find the idea of religion fascinating, but I wasn't coming to this from any deep faith at that point in my life. So getting into that mindset, where, as you say, these things are literally real. Your next door neighbor may have been overtaken by the devil. That's what we saw in the witchcraft trials, which, though my research didn't end up covering any of that, those were happening in this century as well. And again, that was another way of looking at power and control, because while you've got so-called witches, very often these were people who were talented in medicine and herbalism and really understood the meaning of life. And that gave them power to offer genuine help to their fellow members of society. And that made them threatening to the establishments because they were out of control. You've got this theme all the time of, as soon as you were trying to step out of that channel's, this is what you're supposed to do, think, believe, you become a danger, because you may be encouraging others to step out of this very polarized, very controlled situation. And so, of course, again, that's another way in which this idea of the Antichrist was used. These healer types were termed witches, and witches were deemed to have been possessed by the devil. And therefore, it was only right and proper that they should be brutally murdered.
Some examples, maybe top of the head, maybe yes, maybe no, about some of the manifestation of superstition in everyday's life of the people having spells on the doors and things like that. Something comes on top of your head, I just ask you right now, or if not, we move on.
Yeah, no, there is something. Fortunately, there is something landing here. She put me on the spot. I remember, I think it was in around the Civil War era. I remember there being like a newspaper article. So could you imagine this article being published in, I don't know what, I'm British, say the Times, or I don't know what newspaper, or whatever newspaper is supposedly giving you news that is, the word, reliable. Imagine it publishing an article that just said, oh, and last week there was this terrible tragedy where this entire house in the middle of London collapsed, and I don't know how many people died. And the reason behind this tragedy was because taking place in this house on one of the upper stories was a meeting, a gathering of one of the, they called it Catholic, but it could well have been any of the non-conformist sects, had gathered to study the Bible, to commune together, to connect with God, do something that they believed was healthy, helpful. And I would assume that what had happened was that the number of people they'd crammed into the building, the floor had simply collapsed. But that's not what the newspaper article reported. It reported that they had been, occupied in this really highly dangerous act. And so God had punished them by literally destroying the building and killing all of them. And to me, you listening to me saying that now, that might seem a bit like, what, really? Obviously, it was just structural. But no, to a person reading that in their source of news in the 17th century, that was this massive warning of if you actually engage in these illicit activities, you are not only selling your soul to the devil, but you're going to find yourself in hell quite quickly, because God is going to strike you down and put you there right now. So that is the one that springs to mind off the top of my head.
As we could imagine that, of course, there was so much superstition going on about certain birds coming, not coming, landing, showing up, not showing up. Everything was interpreted. If you don't feel good, you might think that the neighbor cast a spell on you. You was always looking for reasons why. If you were sick, you're not just sick because of a virus, or like we know today, we would just say, oh, which virus is coming? There was probably some neighbor put a spell on you, or this and that has happened. And people were still engaging to also to say house witchcraft and shattering glass and making things from wax and stuff like that. Paint. I think there's a lot of old British mansions from the time where we find behind tapestry wax and spells on all the walls that been done. It's quite fascinating when you're renovating those old houses in Britain, as far as I know. Sometimes you remove a wooden panel and you find all kind of pentagrams and things like that. They're supposed to protect that there's no evil spirits coming through the wall or through the cracks in the wall. So all of this was just a world that we have completely forgotten. And that's why I'm so fascinated to talk about, because it was so real, like what we think today our world is real and the things that we know. They were absolutely certain that there's evil spirits at night running around the house trying to find a crack to come in, and they would have never had a doorstep without a proper pentagram or something like it. It would have just been unthinkable that you do something crazy like that to just open the door to a black cat.
Exactly. Yes. And again, there's echoes in certain portions of society today where there is that resurgence of interest in spirituality. And again, we're requiring discernment to work out what is actually valuable and what is actually just superstition that can be manipulated by someone else who would like to control us.
That's exactly what I'm so scared of. That's one of the reasons why I'm podcasting. That's exactly one of the main reasons why I do what I do, because I believe in the value of spirituality, but I'm also keenly aware of the horror of superstition. And it comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. And exactly as you just demonstrated, once a society is under pressure, immediately the clever and smart people, the moneymakers or the power hungry, they just realize they can feed the fear, and they usually do it with superstition, because real spirituality is slow, is healing, takes time, and usually does not require money. That's the problem with real spirituality or spiritual healing. It's just a slow business. While when you have superstition, it's just turbo boost and creates a lot of cash. And that's definitely one of my greatest concerns of the times we're living in, that we're going to, again, repeat all kind of crazy superstition.
And again, I mean, as you say, yes, the cash is certainly one sort of red flag. The biggest red flag that I actually have some personal experience in is this idea of playing on people's fear. So it's really important, if you are engaging in spiritual practices, communities, to just try and take a step back and go, the advice that you're being given, how is it being shaped? Is it coming from a place of love, or is it coming from a place of fear? By which, when I'm talking about a place of fear, it will come along with things like, well, if you don't do this, then this bad thing is going to happen to you, which is exactly what we saw in the 17th century. We tend to think, oh, that's a thing of the past. We've outgrown all of that, but we have not. The modern day cults play on that same fear, and it's tapping into the nervous system, the same as it was back then. It's if you've grown up with a lot of actual trauma in your life, then you are very susceptible to someone coming along and tapping into your fear mechanism, because it's very, very much alive. That is a whole other podcast in and of itself. But
there we should make a bracket, because people have forgotten trauma, so to say. The time that you were talking about, there was trauma on the street, famine, chopping the head. This was people. There's another reason. Maybe take a minute and just open up for people the enormous pressure that the average person was living. Because I think people have forgotten how hard was life used to be.
Yeah, as we said, your very existence was reliance on the goodwill of your landowner. And we'd been living through this time where you've been literally flip-flopping from we worshipping the Catholic Church today or the Protestant Church today. And it had gone. So when Henry VIII passed on, he was succeeded by his son, Edward, who was very sickly and didn't last very long, then succeeded by Mary, who was Catholic, ultra-Catholic, married to the King of Spain and determined that we're going to bring the Catholic Church back in. And she begins burning anyone who is worshipping anything that looks like it might be vaguely Protestant. So you've got the Marian martyrs. Her reign wasn't super long either. And then in comes Elizabeth, who is devoutly Protestant and is now burning all the Catholics. So,
but luckily we got a lot of priest holes from the time, the architecture, something good state, some mysterious British houses with like panels that open up in libraries and you can sneak out. Sorry, I had to bring it in.
I love that you did, because that was actually my very first introduction to history when I was at primary school, so 8, 9, 10 years old. I was in a little village school and it was built right next door to a Tudor manor house, which had the priest holes. So my earliest history lessons were physically going around and exploring priest holes and secret escape passages and all these wonderful things that these houses had. So it was literally a time where you were in fear of your life if you happened to say the wrong thing or annoy a neighbour. That was just on the religious side. We've also spoken a little bit about the witchcraft side of things. So whether you're going to the wrong church or healing yourself in the wrong way, there's a very high likelihood that you're going to end up burned or on a ducking stool and drowned, or even just stuck in some horrific form of corporal punishment to make an exhibition of you and deter others from doing whatever it was you're doing. So yes, trauma is a huge part of that time.
Of course, also agriculture was not as developed as today. So food security, other medical security and other things, like life was hard there. People had children dying constantly. Everybody had several children and a couple of them died. So this was part of everyday's life. So this whole thing, but then we have the tendency to overthink, oh, this was long past. So it's interesting that we're bringing it back and saying maybe food security has changed, but so many underlying problems and techniques have been used present here today. Would you like to a little bit make a pause, so to say, and look at women specifically? Because I think it's important before we go further to the coming age of enlightenment, how we're going to end up, how all of this superstition and all of this has been transformed for the better and worse. Let's make a detour, because we're talking about witchcraft, and we most likely can only talk about witchcraft if we talk about women in a certain sense. So let's look at the women at the time. Do they have voting rights? Were they able to read books? Could they choose their own husband? And just actually also domestics, were they allowed to marry? Yes, no. Could they all fall in love if you were just a domestic, a maid or something like that? Give us a couple of ideas how women used to live at the time.
Yeah, the short answer is no, they didn't really have any rights at all. They were supposed to be dutiful. So whether that was initially, it would be duty to their father, and then they're passed on like a possession to their husbands, and they owe their duty to him. Yeah, definitely no voting rights. Definitely strong encouragement to get married, because if you're unmarried, you're a burden on your family and society because you're not able to work. You are there with pretty much the sole purpose of bearing children as well. So again, if you're not married, you're not actually fulfilling your purpose. So that's one side of the coin. But this is the other interesting arena, because alongside all the political, religious, etc. turmoil, you've also got a slight rebalancing in what's happening in genders. So modern day feminism actually will trace its roots back to the 1660s, maybe even slightly earlier. Some of these religious sects, and the Quakers were one of them, actually, horror of horrors, allowed women to preach. Can you believe it? To actually receive the word of God and share it. No. So anyone that was encouraging that was very much shut down. But then in the 1660s, where you've got Charles II and the restoration of the monarchy, he was very interested in theatre and plays and so on. So that cultural influence is fascinating. And there's one character, a lady called Aphra Bain, who was a female playwright. So that was an example of women holding power that she shouldn't have had, technically. You've also got Charles II having numerous mistresses. A lot of them were actresses, incidentally. Going back a little before that to Charles I, so he was the one who was beheaded at the end of the Civil War. One of the main criticisms of him was that he was quite a weak man and that he was perceived by the country in general to be ruled by his wife, Henrietta Maria, who was the daughter of the French king. So you've also got this underlying friction between the masculine and the feminine. And that also was like another means of criticizing the Catholic Church, because within Catholic doctrine, you've got much more emphasis on Mary, the mother of Christ, as, a figure who wields some power. You pray to Mary. She's kind of taken out Protestant church, and the focus is placed squarely on Christ and on God. So again, you've got this little attempt by women to emerge and gain more power. And the Civil War drives part of that, because as with any war, you've got the entire male population sent off to fight each other and kill each other. So who's staying behind to run shops or look after the land? Well, it's the women. So it's that parallel. We see the same parallel in the First World War and then again the Second World War. So funnily enough, wars, particularly when they're involving a large proportion of the populace, are a vehicle for female empowerment, because suddenly women have to step into the male role. And it becomes a case of, when you restore peace, are you able to wrest that power back onto the patriarchy or not?
Well, thank you so much, because one thing I've already promised myself, a mental note, I will read on the Quaker history. So I'm so thankful that you gave me a homework for my Christmas break. I'm already going mentally on Kindle and downloading some books about the history of the Quakers, because they seem to have played a much stronger role that I was absolutely aware of. So that's a very novel information, how important they were at the time, obviously listening to you, and of course their immigration to the New World, and obviously the role that they have played further on.
Yeah. So funnily enough, William Penn, who was one of the key Quaker figures, came from my part of the country. Literally a few miles down the road from me was where he lived before he went over to the States. And Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, is named after him. He was quite influential in the setting up of the governments in the early days over there.
And what happened to the Quakers from time? Did they also simply immigrate because they were outnumbered in the end? Or they managed to get certain influence? Because that now seems to be a whole conversation about the Quakers one way or the other. They seem to be one of the key elements of all the things that you just explained, but they somehow seem to have made an important role, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, maybe I'm overegging the role that they actually played, because I obviously resonated with them, and this is what I'm remembering. But I think they were successful. The few non-conformist groups that managed to survive were the ones that managed to conform just enough to not break the new rules, who would have had people at the top of their organization who managed to wangle their way into governments and into favor with the new monarchy, and therefore become legitimate in that way. And also who just really kept their heads down. So if they weren't a threat, then nobody needed to chase them. So, and I feel like, from what I know of the Quakers today, they are very much about peace and acceptance. So they're not really a particularly threatening force, whereas some of the other groups that were emerging were a lot more gung-ho and let's destroy this and let's destroy that. So they would have been far more suppressed than any group that was more peaceful in their ways.
But where we are at this next juncture is that we've seen that the women's role has changed through this transition, that chaos, the civil war, and all that coming and going and religious turmoil. So there was a change of a new dawn, or basically an understanding of a new time, because whatever the books might have brought bad at the beginning, the pamphlets and all the hate, the spread and the chaos, but never mind, they were here and people were being able to read and so forth. So the books are here to stay, and the women are here to stay, and obviously the Quaker are here to stay. So that's a bit where we are right now in our conversation. So do you think it's a good time to look at then what was then the need for this further going, that more scientific or more knowledge driven became superstitious too much, or became the chaos too much? Or what do you think were the elements that said, okay, we have to leave this darkness and bring in more light? Was it a natural development, or was simply the pressure on society too great? This was just drowning in superstition and execution and things like that. Can you just bring us to that moment?
Yeah, so I feel that the people that were in power managed to weave things around to very closely link any threat to their power with a particular kind of femininity that was more linked to chaos. So we've got the imagery of the Whore of Babylon was the key image in there. So in a way, although you've got some women coming into power, ultimately ended up actually being a suppression of women in their essence as creative beings, as spiritual beings, as free-flowing. And much as the Quakers survived, I don't think that they had women preachers still after the 1650s when things settled down and we reorganized the control. I'm not sure that element survived all the way through. It's come back now, but I think there was a period where it was very much a case of this chaos being seen as an emblem of the dangers of femininity, and hence the need to stamp down and bring in this real rational response that is about order. So it was, in a sense, of we've been through this incredible chaos, darkness, no one was safe, huge instability. As we haven't even mentioned, also in that 1665, you've got the bubonic plague that was spreading throughout, that decimated a massive proportion of not just England, but across Europe as well, and the fire of London. So not only have you got civil war, you've got acts of nature, and all of this within that framework of everything is caused by God is, oh my gosh, England must have really badly upset God to have experienced this 100 years. So any idea of femininity coming through is that just creates chaos. We need to squash it. So I think that's what lay behind this flip around to let's make everything very rational and very scientific, because you've got the science coming through at that point as well. Some of our key scientific figures were emerging in the 17th century too. So it's really this entire picture of the crumbling of an old order, the bringing in of a new order, but what form is that order going to take? And this is where I feel it gets fascinating for us. In studying it, we're looking at like a rebirth process. The question is, was the thing that we birthed actually better than the thing that it's replaced? And I would just invite us to look around at the planet and the society today, and to look from this framework of actually we are going through another rebirth process right now. So let's be conscious about what it is that we truly desire to birth from this one. And are there perhaps some lessons that we can learn, not just from the 17th century, there's other periods in history as well where you see these rebirth processes. So that's where I see things being relevant and shaping up.
That was such an interesting shortcut that you made. We have an established system, then chaos comes, overlapping things, doors opening, possibilities opening up. and also mixed in with the chaos, the fires, and the plague, and all of these things. And in the end, they're looking the weakest thing to blame, why God is angry. And of course, it must be the women. What else can it possibly be? Look no further.
It's always
So
the
simple.
women.
It's always the women, right?
Yeah.
And then we basically we can't bring that the old, so we replace it again with a male dominant structure. That's science. And say, okay, let's bring forth science and knowledge as a way out, which something good came out of it. But there was a huge price to be paid because women, as you said, been shut back down again. And that female, as you described it, that wild nature, that spiritual, that witchcraft world of emotions, again, obviously society couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
And they killed it again, this time with science. So what used to be, if we make it like a long cut, what used to be killed by God or the Catholic Church or the control, so this killed the female energy, and the Catholic Church was fighting for several hundred years against druids, against natural meeting in the forest, making the fires, all of this nature religion that we had in Europe. The Catholic Church was fighting against it for a really long time until finally women were under control, so to say.
Yeah.
And then this short opening up of chaos brings again female energy and female power, and immediately men shut it down, this time through science.
Yeah.
And now you said that we are back to the same spot. And it's so interesting that you say that, because I was really wondering, because I can see that there's such a strong energy of bringing again female energy to the table, if for all kind of different systems. And we both, I guess, sit here and wonder right now if men again find a way to shut it down.
I think if they do, our planet is actual female energy. And it does feel like, I mean, I know in the 17th century, they thought they were on their last legs and about to witness the end of the world. But it does feel like we're in that same situation. And if we're shutting down the female energy, then are we actually shutting down our planet this time? That would be the question that's on my mind and on a lot of people's minds. And it's not to make the mistake of coming at this and allowing the female chaos to come through, because that's going to shut down the male energy, which is just going to throw us off balance in a different direction. It's both masculine and feminine need to heal into their balanced expression. And that healing takes place within each one of us as individuals, interrelated between us as different genders and throughout society as a whole. And it's not only the actual literal physical gender, it's also about all the various expressions of masculinity and femininity that are so out of balance at the moment. So that would be my invitation to the world right now.
Things I would like to say, because one word you mentioned, I think 4 or 5 times, and that's control.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it's so interesting that you came in funny loopy circles back to the word control on several junctures. And I think most probably if you would take this podcast and pin every time you say control, it would get a very interesting kind of listening, because it is exactly what it is, right? That there are so many of us, male or female, by the end of the day, who just can't imagine a world without control.
Yeah.
And we always see certain dangers, God, nature, God knows what. And we think we need to deal with this by being in control. So that's one thing that I've really taken from this interview. Another thing is that actually we did have examples on Earth where this actually worked out. And one of them are the Witchers in Europe. It's a very ancient society, but they were female and male total harmony. And they lived in a perfect harmony and for a really long period of time. And they've been a driving culture for all the whole Danube and Sava region in what's now essential in Balkan Europe, down to Greece, actually. So they've been for a really long time a perfectly harmonious society, a society without kings, a society without any war. And they've built vast societies over a very big territory, and they were prosperous in terms of commerce and science. They discovered metallurgy and things like that. So they were really successful, and they lived a time without war. And one of the things I always found interesting, even when you were man and wife, had a land that had kings and children, and you were farming your piece of land, the children usually moved on and built their own farms, And once the elderly could not deal with the land anymore, it just came back into society, because the land is there for the ones who actually has the hands to work on it. It's the respect to the land. So it was an amazing society without control, as we would understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nature was their friend.
Yes, that's it. Again, that's the partnership between humans and the planet. And that's what we've lost with it's not also as alongside control. It's also about connection or disconnection. We're disconnected within ourselves. We're disconnected from one another, and we're disconnected from our planet.
What's your take? You have 2 minutes time. Why are we so afraid? What last final words? What is driving us constantly into that fear since we lost the Winter times? Because it's really long time ago, and ever since we're scared. Why are we so scared? What is your final last words from our historian? Why are we chicken?
It's trauma. The trauma comes from, it's an instinctual nervous system reaction. When you go back, I'm thinking like going back even further to 3000 BC, when prior to that time you had a divine feminine, in place across the planet. We're talking maybe going to Egypt, sort of that sort of area. And again, a time of peace. And what comes in is some kind of marauding tribe that brings in war. And if you've been in a space where you've only ever lived in peace, you don't know how to defend yourself. So the degree of trauma that experienced was so huge that then feeds into everything that creates the fear that's so easy to tap into. So that's on a global scale. And it's within each single one of us as well. We've inherited the trauma of our ancestors for hundreds of years now. And there's a lot of trauma in the way we rear children. So it's not, I'm not blaming the parents or anything, but it's just our social norms are not set up to help us connect and to help support the nervous system from a biological response. So I would say that if we really want world peace, we really want this beautiful birth of a new age, it's not about telling governments what to do. It's about each single one of us taking responsibility for starting to heal our own trauma, so that we're not then automatically reacting from this space of fear. Because once you can come in to react from a rational mind perspective, then you can make different decisions and experience different outcomes.
This is a Christmas, New Year wish, if I ever heard one. Heal the world by healing your own trauma. Let go of your fears, and you will have a bit better decision-making abilities. Well, Katie, thank you so much for taking the time to your old dissertation. Sorry for my injections. I brought you off the hook, but it was wonderful. And I learned so much in this conversation already. My reading list has been grown over the last hour. Thank you so very much. I hope I'll see you again.
Oh, I'm sure we will. Thank you so much for having me and for all your beautiful interjections and the perspectives and wisdom that you bring so much as well. And yeah, it's a joy to connect with you, and I hope it happens again soon. Thank you.